After this morning's session, we might rightly ask ourselves, why do people have such a hard time with truth and with the truth of the Word of God? Why is there such a debate about truth? Why isn't it just plain obvious to people? Well, Romans chapter 1 is going to answer that question. Romans chapter 1 is a biblical analysis of humanity's attitude to truth. Let me say that again. Romans chapter 1 is a biblical analysis of mankind's attitude to truth. So if you've still got your Bible open, look at verse 18 at the end. They hold the truth in unrighteousness. That word hold literally means to suppress. Not hold as in hold on to, but to hold down, to suppress. So what's mankind's attitude to truth? To suppress it. Look down to verse 25. Who changed the truth of God into a lie. Perhaps better rendered, who exchanged the truth of God for a lie. So here's the truth being suppressed in verse 18, the truth being exchanged in verse 25. Now, as we go down Romans chapter 1, we're being given a history lesson. There's a sort of a cascade going from one step to the next. So let's start at verse 19. Here's the start of this little run through human history by Paul, directed by the Spirit of God. So we start in verse 19 with the power and glory of God in display. That which may be known of God. It's manifested. It's being shown. Verse 20, they can see it. They can understand it. No one can plead ignorance. So this verse is simply saying, these two verses are simply saying that to everybody under the canopy of heaven, every human being on planet Earth, God has put something on display 24/7. We talk about 24/7. So there are no closing times to this revelation from God. 24 hours a day, whether it's under the microscope, whether it's in the telescope, however it might be, God has put on a display of his glory and of his power and of his nature and of his attributes. What does man do with that display? What does man do with that divine exposition of truth? Well, here it is. He does three things. Number one, in verse 18, he suppresses it. The Greek scholar A.T. Robertson says of this verse, truth is out in the open, but wicked men, so to speak, put it in a box, sit on the lid, and hold it down in unrighteousness. You say, well, what way do they suppress it? Well, they're suppressing it from actually having an effect on them. They are deliberately not allowing the truth to take hold of their heart. Somebody said to me just yesterday that they were asked to take a funeral, and the person that asked them said, just speak about the person that died, but don't mention God, don't mention the Bible. Why are people so afraid and so resistant? They don't believe that God exists, they don't believe that the gospel is true, but they don't even want you to mention it. They've had this allergic reaction to it. This is verse 18. They are seeking to suppress it. They don't want it to get near them. They don't want it to govern their conduct. They don't even want it to flow out to others, to their children, to their friends. So, God puts his truth on display. Man suppresses it. What happens? Verse 21. His mind becomes darkened. I think this is going to be helpful to you. So you're watching a debate on YouTube between a Christian and an atheist. And the Christian seems to be making all these good arguments, and the atheist just has answers to everything. He has a way around it all, and he can make it all sound so plausible, and he doesn't seem to have a problem with the universe coming out of nothing. He doesn't seem to have a problem with the theory of evolution. He seems very clever, and you might just think for a moment, maybe there's something to what this guy's saying. How is it that he has the same evidence as you do? He can read the Bible, he can look up at the stars. How come he doesn't see what you see? Well, you see, once a person decides, as a volitional act of the heart, not to allow God to get in on them, there are consequences. Romans chapter 1 says, their mind becomes darkened. That's a solemn thing. So these leading men, we're thinking of Richard Dawkins and others. You have your men in Canada and the US. Over here you have people like Daniel Dennett and Harris and Krauss and other men. They don't look like it. But biblically, the Spirit of God is telling us their minds are darkened. You say, but they're clever. Yeah, look at verse 22. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Somebody said to me in the interval, Richard Dawkins needs more faith to be an atheist than I do to be a Christian. I know exactly what that person's saying by that. Because it's not really faith, but I know what that person's saying. How is it that, on the one hand, these guys are obviously clever, obviously brilliant, obviously scientific, they can write books, they can do experiments and all, they get Nobel Prizes and all that, that's all wonderful. But how is it that at the same time they just do not believe in God? They do not believe in the Bible. They just don't. They have become vain in their imaginations and their foolish heart has become darkened. They profess themselves to be wise, but they're actually fools. So, number one, the suppression of truth and its consequences. But what does he do now? Verse 23, he changes the glory of God, the glory of the uncorruptible God, into an image made like unto corruptible men. So he's looking back in history and saying, look, when Adam and Eve were there in the Garden of Eden, they knew there was a God. For 1,000 years after that, Adam was on earth. Anybody that didn't believe in God, you could just go to Adam and say, God, Adam, tell this fella he's got doubts. And Adam could say, well, where do you think I came from? So the knowledge of God was there for the first 1,000 years. As time went by, men fell into idolatry. Why? Because they exchanged the glory of God into this image of made like unto corruptible man. So they're downgrading the glory of their Creator and making God into their own image, fashioning a God like themselves. Unbelievable. What happens? Moral catastrophe follows, verse 24. God gave them over to uncleanness. So hand in hand with the rejection of God goes moral uncleanness. So man represses the truth, verse 18. Man downgrades God's glory, verse 23. Now here's the big thing in verse 25. The final step. He exchanges the truth of God for a lie. Now I'm not sure what version you've got with you today. If I was to read this in Greek, it would read like this. Verse 25. Who exchanged the truth of God into the lie. This is a staggering statement. The truth gets exchanged for the lie. Now, it wasn't an accident. Look at verse 28. Even as they did not like, they did not want to retain God in their knowledge. Verse 32, they knew they were wrong. They knew it was against God, but they had pleasure in it and pleasure in the company of it. What a catastrophic description of human history. Now mark this. How different that is to the way the world thinks about itself. So if you were to look up a philosophical history of the world written by a modern day philosopher, it would more unlikely say the exact opposite. Romans chapter 1 tells us they start with a knowledge of God. They move down a step and accept polytheism, multiple gods. Moving down a step further, they have accepted the lie. Now they're into all kinds of abominable behaviors and deliberate reprobation and judgment. This is a downhill pathway. Look up your history books. Look up an atheist story of history. It is the exact opposite. Here would be Richard Dawkins' story of history. Well, you see, when man first appeared off the savannah in Africa, he was an animist who worshipped the trees. And then eventually he graduated from animism to polytheism. Well, that was a sort of a step in the right direction. And then eventually the monotheistic religions of Christianity and Islam and Judaism came along. And finally we all grew up and realized that God didn't make us. We actually made God. And we're all now atheists. And it's all now wonderful. It's a steady progress up and up and up and up. So in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, he has a chapter in which he pompously makes the claim that the more intelligent a person is, the less likely he is to believe in God. And if you look at societies, the ones that are the best educated, there's the bigger percentage of atheists in them. And so here's the story that man would like to put. Human history has been a chart of progress from ignorance to knowledge, from the primitive to the sophisticated, from the Stone Age to the Space Age. It's getting better. That sounds like a song, doesn't it? It's getting better. It's getting bigger. It's getting more wonderful. And so Charles Darwin, he's writing in his autobiography, quote, "Believing as I do that man in the distant future will be a far more perfect creature than he now is." And so this is what science is trying to teach to us, artificial intelligence and the next step, man and machine in perfect harmony. And it's all a deliberate attempt to twist the true history of humanity and turn it on its head. Have you ever heard that poem, "Once I was a tadpole beginning to begin"? Have you heard that one? Once I was a tadpole beginning to begin. Then I was a frog with my tail tucked in. Next I was an ape in a coconut tree. And now I'm a scientist with a PhD. Mankind has this story that it tells itself. A story of progress. No, says God. It's not like that at all. I mentioned this afternoon an atheistic philosopher by the name of Bertrand Russell. He lived from 1872 to 1970. He wrote a famous tract or book called "Why I Am Not a Christian." Somebody challenged him one day and said to him, "Right, Bertrand, just follow me for a moment now. Let's just say you die and you end up standing before God after all. Turns out you were wrong. There really is a God, and you're now standing before him. And he says to you, 'Why didn't you believe in me?' What would you say to him?" Said Bertrand Russell, "I would say to him, not enough evidence. Not enough evidence." Now that is an attempt to fly in the face of Romans chapter 1. What did we read in verse 20 at the end? They are without excuse. Why are they without excuse? Because there is enough evidence, and the evidence is on display. They have no excuse for their unrighteousness, no excuse for their ungratefulness, no excuse for their idolatry, no excuse for mistaking who God is. Now here, let me make a claim. That friend of yours who's an atheist, that professor of yours who's an atheist, that neighbor of yours who's an atheist, and you just can't get through to them. Perhaps you think that their problem is intellectual. And you just think, if I could just read one more apologetic book, watch one more 3-hour debate on YouTube, I would finally have the argument that I'd give to them, and then I'll convince them. Romans chapter 1 teaches us this, if it teaches us anything. That man's problem with truth is not intellectual. It is volitional. Now, what does volitional mean? Well, volitional is to do with your will. It's what you want, your volition. It's all a question of choice. What kind of world do you want? What kind of universe do you want? What kind of life do you want? What kind of lifestyle do you want? That's where the problem is. Man's problem is not intellectual. His problem is volitional. You see, again, I was talking to someone in the interval about this. We often allow the atheist to have too much ground when we're talking to them. If an atheist says to you they don't believe in God, we kind of think, oh, they don't believe in anything. There isn't anybody alive today who doesn't believe in anything. You can't live in a vacuum. Verse 25 says they've rejected the truth. Does that leave you in a vacuum when you reject the truth? When you reject the truth, the very act of rejecting the truth means you're believing the lie. And so these people in Romans 1, they weren't atheists, we know that. They were idol worshippers. But they had put a god of their own making in place of the true God that made them. What is idolatry? It's giving pride of place to a god substitute. It's venerating a god of your own making. And this is what these people were doing in Romans chapter 1. You say, well, does that apply to atheists? Absolutely. These people were bowing down to metal idols. The atheistic scientists and philosophers of our day are bowing down to mental idols. Verse 25, follow it with me one more time. They exchanged the truth for the lie. They exchanged the worship of the true God for the worship of idols. Now, here's a question for you. What's the big lie today? What's the big exchange today? What's taking pride of place on the television, in academia, and in the media? What is the big alternative meta-narrative, the big story that our culture has swallowed, has accepted? What is the reigning paradigm in 21st century Western society? It is the lie of naturalism. You say, what is naturalism? Well, think of the first part of that word, naturalism, nature. Naturalism is the idea that there's nothing other than the physical parts of the cosmos around us. That's all that exists. In the words of Sagan, the universe is all that is or was or ever will be. There are no miracles. There are no souls. There's no heaven. There's no hell. There's no God. That is the big lie. That everything came from nothing by accident. That life arose from non-life by chance. That genetic variation and natural selection accounts for everything. That the universe is all that is or was or ever will be. And the truth of the Bible and the truth of theism, the truth of the gospel has been jettisoned. And in its place has come this tremendous explanatory mechanism, the lie of evolution. Good old Charles Darwin. I don't know whether you saw recently, but a letter he wrote in 1880 sold recently for $197,000. You can go online and check it up. Just type in $197,000 Darwin letter or something, and you'll get it. It just sold in September. Now, why am I mentioning this letter? Because we, again, give atheistical scientists too much credit by imagining that they're all unbiased, they're all dispassionate, they're all honest. They all come to their laboratory in the morning thinking, well, if I get evidence that there's a God, I'll believe it, and if I don't, I won't. No. What you'll find is, as in Romans chapter 1, there is a deliberate bias going on here that stems from the fallen nature of man. Darwin did not approach his study of nature ready to believe either way. He was raised a Unitarian. That is to say, he was brought up believing no virgin birth, no deity of Christ, no Trinity, just a form of godliness but denying the power thereof. So somebody wrote to him and asked him, I want to read your book, The Origin of Species, but before I read it, I don't want it to destroy my faith in the New Testament. So can you please tell me whether or not you believe in the New Testament? And I'd like to know that, and then I'll read your book. And if you, whatever you say, I'll just keep it private. And he did. He kept this private. It only came out this month, last month in September. And here in Darwin's handwriting, you can see it online. He writes to this man, "Dear sir, I am sorry to have to inform you that I do not believe in the Bible as a divine revelation, and therefore not in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. Yours faithfully, Charles Darwin." And those who studied his life will tell you that Darwin superimposed a certain philosophical worldview onto nature and then went around gathering the facts to boost that. He was very angry with God through the death of his sister and so on and so forth. He thought the Gospels were full of errors. Do you know what he called natural selection? He wrote another letter in which he described that he believed not in the intervention of creative power, because if I believed in the intervention of creative power, that would make my deity, natural selection, superfluous. A staggering statement. Romans chapter 1, they've exchanged the truth of a creator God for the lie of idolatry. Here's Darwin. He rejects the deity of Christ. He's a Unitarian. He becomes an atheist. He exchanges the truth for what? A God of his own making. He calls it natural selection, tongue-in-cheek, many a word of truth spoken in jest. My deity. So, what are we learning? Atheism is deliberate. Atheism does not come naturally. Doesn't matter what they say. Atheism is a deliberate rejection of God. Atheism is ill-motivated. It's not unbiased. It comes from the fallen nature of rebellious man who doesn't want God telling him what to do. Atheism is inexcusable. We mustn't look at an atheist and say, "Oh, poor fella, he's so sincere. And he really means well. He just can't get his head round the fact that there's a God." No. The fool has said in his heart, "There is no God." Psalm 14, verse 1. Atheism is absolutely inexcusable. Why? Because God is obvious. Absolutely obvious. Atheism is ungrateful. Neither were thankful. Atheism is darkening to the mind. Oh, yes, people may still have intellectual abilities and so on, be able to do experiments, but it darkens their appreciation of truth. Atheism is foolish. Atheism is a bedfellow of sinful behavior. Do you see that fellow I mentioned to you this afternoon? I'm just going to get his name. Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell was an atheistic philosopher. A fellow called Dr. James Spiegel wrote a book called The Making of an Atheist, published by Moody Publishers in 2010. This is what Dr. James Spiegel said about Bertrand Russell. Now, Bertrand Russell's the man who said, if I ever stood before God, I would say not enough evidence. He's the man that wrote the book, Why I'm Not a Christian. So somebody's writing a biography about him, The Making of an Atheist. This is Dr. James Spiegel, published by Moody Press. This is what he says. Bertrand Russell was misogynistic, a serial adulterer, a chronic seducer of women, especially very young women, even in his old age. Does that shock you? So, bring it up to date. One of the most prominent, virulent, brilliant atheists of our day is a man called Christopher Hitchens. His brother Peter lives in Oxford, not far from me, and would believe in Christianity and so on. Doesn't accept inspiration of Scripture, but that's another story. His brother Christopher was a virulent atheist. Died recently of lung cancer. Why did he get lung cancer? He spent his life in total and absolute hedonism. He was drunk most of the time, smoked like a chimney, lived an immoral life. He was a blaspheming, evil, wicked man. He used to describe God as a celestial North Korea. You say, what does that mean? Celestial North Korea. Well, that's a Freudian slip. North Korea is a communist country. It's the place where there are something like 50,000 Christians in jail right now as we're sitting here. North Korea is the most oppressive big brother communistic society in the world, bar none. They control everybody. They know what everybody's doing. They don't allow the people to have the internet and find out what's going on in the world. It's all 1984 all over again. Says Hitchens, the God of the Bible is a celestial North Korea. What's he saying? He actually says in his debates, do you want a God that knows what you're thinking? Who knows every thought that's gone through your head, know where you go every day, and then one day you're going to have to answer, I don't want a God like that. See what he's doing? He's accidentally letting out that his real problem with God is not intellectual. His real problem is that he wants Christopher Hitchens to run Christopher Hitchens' life. He wants Christopher Hitchens to be the king. He wants Christopher Hitchens to do what he wants to do. He doesn't want a God telling him where he should be and what he should. Atheism is culpable. This is very serious, verse 18. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven. Do you know why the judgment of the great white throne doesn't happen until the end of time? Why can't we have a system where as soon as you die, you then go to the judgment and that's it? Why is the judgment kept until the end? Because the likes of Christopher Hitchens and Charles Darwin, they have died and gone. But their wicked works are still having a bad effect on people. So Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great. This is the name of his book. That's still blinding people's minds. That's still encouraging people to be atheists. That's still saying, don't believe in the celestial North Korea. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Darwin's book is still casting a long shadow over our world. And not until the end of human history will God call in all the deeds and open the books and the judgment will be said. Now, second point on my screen here is atheism is ill-motivated. I just want to revisit that because there might be someone here saying, I think you're being a bit extreme. You know, my next door neighbor's an atheist, but I can't believe for a minute that he's really hates God and he loves his sin. I mean, he seems to be faithful to his wife, you know. Okay, Hitchens and Bertrand Russell, they may have been bad, but not all atheists are bad. There's some lovely atheists, some wonderful atheists. I find it hard to believe that it's ill-motivated. Well, what else could it be? What does Psalm 8 verse 3 say? Psalm 8 verse 3 pictures someone going out into the countryside in the dark, long before electric lights were invented, and looking up. Look at these lovely words. When I consider the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars, what is man that thou art mindful of him? In other words, the beauty and excellence of God in creation is something that human beings know intuitively. You say, well, okay, I'm following you now. Someone ought to be able to look up at the sky and think there must be a God. So why are they so happy to engage with atheism? I mean, my daughter was the only person. So she went to school, little country school in near Buckingham in England. She was in a class of 25 girls and boys. She was the only one in the class who believed God existed. I'm not talking about the only one who went to church, the only one who believed in the Bible. She's the only one in the class who actually believed that there is a God. This is England. 21st century England. Atheism rules okay in our country. We say, well, why would they want that? Because atheism is actually harmful to the individual. We learned this afternoon that if you get rid of God, you get rid of meaning, you get rid of truth, you get rid of free will, you get rid of beauty, you get rid of all these things that you and I appreciate. You say, well, how does that happen? Okay, so an atheist is married, and this wife that he's married to loves him dearly. But in the back of his head, he's thinking, does she really love me? It's just neurons firing in her head, you know. So an atheist goes out, and the sun is shining, the rain's coming down, and he sees this rainbow. And he's about to say, isn't that beautiful? And then he says, well, that's just the physical properties of H2O reacting with this, and that's the way. He robs himself of the appreciation of beauty. He robs himself of the appreciation of the love of his wife. He lies in bed at night and thinks, is my life worth living? And he thinks, well, I give to charity. I'm a member of the Rotary Club, and I send money to save the children. And then he thinks to himself, yeah, but why do I do that? I mean, those children are going to die, and that's the end of them. I'm going to die, and that's the end of me. Eventually, the star is going to burn out, and it'll all be a waste of time. So Hitler's life and Mother Teresa's life, ultimately, in a million years' time, won't make any difference. So what's the point? He's robbed himself of meaning. His own life is going to end abruptly, very shortly. He will be forgotten. It's as if he was just like a match struck in the dark and blown out again. So this hopeless existential crisis, he's brought it on himself by rejecting. Why would he do that? Why would he remove God from the equation and leave himself in a philosophical wasteland where the best option is suicide, if he was being honest? Well, it's here in Romans chapter 1. It's because man's heart is at enmity with God and wants to live independent of him. I mentioned this afternoon Mr. Dawkins. Dawkins has a great laugh at Christians. He says, when you find a person who doesn't believe in evolution, he is either wicked, he's either mad, insane, or wicked. And he calls faith a mental illness. Says Dawkins, it's either faith or evidence. So the Christians just believe in the teeth of the evidence. I wait for evidence. And if I've got evidence, if you've got evidence, why do you need faith? Just wait a minute. In Romans chapter 1, we're being introduced to a power greater than power evidence. As you come through verse 18 and 19 and 20 and 21, here's God giving us evidence after evidence after evidence. That which may be known of God, it's manifest. God has showed it. It's clearly seen. They knew God. Here's the evidence. But there's a power being revealed in these verses that's greater than the power of evidence. What is it? It's the power of unbelief. I told you earlier on, I'm reading Luke's Gospel at the moment. In Luke chapter 6, there's a fantastic story there. The man with the withered hand. Remember that story? It's the Sabbath. And the Lord is in the presence of these Pharisees and these scribes. They're out to get him. And they're thinking, well, if he's going to heal this man on the Sabbath, we're going to have everything we need. And the Lord is there, and he looks about them. The other gospel says he looks about them in anger. And here's the man with this deformed hand. And the Lord says to the man, stretch forth your hand. And here's this weak, the right hand comes out, this weak, withered hand. And the Lord heals that man, and his withered hand becomes straight and strong. And everybody sees the evidence with their eyes. No one's got any excuse. They've seen a miracle wrought right in front of them. You know what the next verse says? Then took they counsel to destroy Jesus. There's something greater than the power of evidence. It's the innate, volitional power of unbelief in the human heart. The same thing in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 4. Here's the lame man. In chapter 3, he's at the gate of the beautiful gate of the temple. Peter and John are going up to the temple. They heal the man. Consternation all round. The Sanhedrin get Peter and John and say, right, you need to stop preaching. Enough of this preaching. They keep on going preaching. They bring them in again. And then Luke, in his gospel, he tells you what they said behind backs. Listen to these words. Acts chapter 4, verse 16. This is the enemies of the gospel, the scribes, the Pharisees. They're saying, that a notable miracle has been done is manifest to all that are in Jerusalem, and we cannot deny it. Oh, well, then they're going to be saved. They've got all the evidence. They've admitted a miracle. It's an undeniable miracle. Well, they're going to be saved then. You don't even need faith. They've got the evidence. So what do they do next? But this gospel spread no further. Let us straightly charge these men that they preach no more in his name. That is how willful the heart of man is. Scientists that are atheists are not dispassionate, noble, unbiased, honest people. They have fallen natures and they have rejected God and they are in the dark. Now, you say, what's this got to do with the origin of the universe? Nothing will show the darkness of the atheistical mind than the contortions that they will go through to get round the origin of the universe. Let me quote you Mr. Francis Crick. Who was Francis Crick? Anybody heard of Francis Crick? He was the co-discoverer of the double helix of the DNA. Back in 1953, I think it was in England. He won a Nobel Peace Prize for it. Not the Peace Prize, the Nobel Prize for Science. In an article called Lessons from Biology, he's writing to his fellow students, his fellow scientists. And as he writes these words. Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Can you see what's happening? You know, my son is studying in the medical field. And he sometimes says to me, he says, Dad, he says, when I find out how the body works, I just think, how on earth does anybody read all the functions of the liver and all this and the heart? How do they see that and not believe in God? It's just unbelievable. Says Crick, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather it evolved. What's he saying? Don't let the light in. Don't let God into your thoughts. Keep fixed on evolution. Get a hold of the lie of evolution and reject the truth of the gospel, reject the truth of God. Don't admit design. You say, well, that's quite an admission. Oh, that's not the half of it. There's a guy over here in Harvard. You can Google this name afterwards. Richard Lewontin, Lewontin. This is one of the most staggering quotes I've ever heard in my whole life. Let me read it to you. This is a scientist in Harvard. Says he, it is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation for the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation, a set of concepts that produce material explanations. No matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, the materialism is absolute. We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. What a staggering statement. This is a Harvard scientist, and he's openly admitting that when they come across DNA and they think to themselves, oh boy, look at this. How are we going to explain this? A digitally coded database, more complex than the Encyclopedia Britannica. How on earth could that arise by chance? Oh, that's no problem. No matter how counterintuitive, we can produce a material explanation. What's my motive? No divine foot in the door. We do not want God. Now, way back in the days of Darwin, he had a friend called Huxley. And this friend Huxley, they called him Darwin's bulldog. Not that Darwin had a real bulldog, but this guy was a pugnacious defender of Darwin. He used to go to battle. Darwin was quite a quiet, retiring fellow. But this Huxley fellow, he would go out and he would fight Darwin's corner. Huxley had a son. His name was Aldous Huxley. If you've ever heard of a book called Brave New World, that was written by Aldous Huxley. He was educated at Eton. Eton is where all the British Prime Ministers are educated. It's a very posh place. So he's highly educated. He's the son of Huxley, Aldous Huxley. He writes A Brave New World. So he's the grandson of Thomas Henry Huxley. He writes a staggering admission as to why he was an atheist. Why he wanted to believe in Darwinism. Why he wanted to believe in it. Now let me just quote this to you. Says he, this is Aldous Huxley, grandson of Darwin's bulldog. I had motives for not wanting the world to have meaning. He didn't want the world to have meaning. Why on earth would an Eton-educated Englishman not want the world to have meaning? Well, he says that I had motives. For myself, no doubt, says he, as for the most of my contemporaries, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation. The liberation we desired was, simultaneously, liberation from a certain political and economic system and liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to the morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom. We objected to the political and economic system because it was unjust. See what he's saying? So those of you who lived through the 1960s and the 70s, you remember Woodstock, Beatles, LSD, remember all that? Do you know what that was all about? It was the fruit of 1859 and Darwin's theory of evolution finally coming out into full blaze of day. Having got rid of God, and therefore having got rid of absolutes, and having got rid of meaning, Aldous Huxley, grandson of Thomas Henry Huxley, Eton-educated Englishman, author of The Brave New World, he says, it was liberation. Now we can sin with abandon. Now we can do drugs and do abortions, and we can sleep with whoever we want to sleep with, and we can do all of that without celestial North Korea in our way. It's Romans 1 all over again. Western society has repeated Romans chapter 1 from the 1950s to here, 2015. It's an absolute repeat. Gay marriage didn't come out of nowhere, you know. It wasn't us finally waking up to say we made a mistake for the last 6,000 years. It is the direct fruit of a rejection of absolute truth. So here in Romans chapter 1, we're introduced to what I would call the unmistakable God. Do you know, I actually believe human beings don't need to have the Creator's existence proved to them. I think we're wasting our time. I think the approach we should take is just to get under their skin and just say to them, sorry, you really believe in God underneath. You know there's a God. Next time you meet an atheist and he's, well, so many, just say, listen, you know there's a God. And there'll be a big bell inside, like the size of Big Ben, just clang, 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 telling them, yeah, that guy's right. They know, they have to know that the God of the Bible is unmistakable. Let me just run through these points. Creation's magnificence exhibits God's glory. The heavens declare the glory of God. I know we live in cities and street lights and everything. Next time you get the chance, just you go out somewhere where there's no lights, not many people, on a cold summer night, lie down on your back and look up. creation's magnificence. The heavens declare, nobody except one deliberately running from God could deny that there must be a God. Creation's immensity. I tried to describe it to you this afternoon. 170 billion galaxies, each containing 400 billion stars. Can you even begin? What must the God of heaven be like? He made the stars also. He stretched out a septillion stars. Unbelievable. He describes it in 4 or 5 words in Genesis 1. How did he do it? With his word. He spake, and it was done. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, for he spake, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. Creation's magnificence, creation's immensity, creation's variety. I don't know whether we got any biologists here or anything, but, well, just read Job chapter 38 and 39. Creation's variety. I love the way God challenges Job. Here's a good one. God says to Job, have you considered the goodly wings of the peacock? You ever seen the goodly wings of the peacock? Where on earth did he get those from? The goodly wings of the most extravagant looking display of God's creativity. What about God's perfections? Creation's beauty exhibits God's perfection. I've really enjoyed just getting some of these things ready. It's a while since I've spoken on this subject, and all of this is available on the internet now. But you type in something like the Crab Nebula or something like that, or the human eye. I'll show you some things later on this evening. Just blow your mind. Absolutely blow your mind. And you would have to be a deliberate unbeliever to stare those things in the face. No, there couldn't be a God. Keep reminding yourself, this wasn't designed. Why do you have to keep reminding yourself it wasn't designed? Sounds like you've got a problem. Creation's complexity exhibits God's wisdom. You know, the Bible actually says that God created the world through his wisdom and through his understanding. Have you ever thought about that? Okay, so we have the earth here, spinning on its axis once every 24 hours. Isn't that amazing? We're spinning round it, and yet we can't feel that. And then there's another thing called the moon, and it goes round the earth at the same time as the earth goes round itself. Isn't that good? And it controls the tides and gives us light at night time when the clouds are not there. And then you see this earth that's spinning on itself, and then this moon that's going around. Both of them are going around the sun. Isn't that good? And it goes around the sun every 365 days. And it never goes out to that far. Honestly, come on. You think that could happen by chance? I mean, what? We're giving them too much credit. Creation's complexity. I'll tell you later on tonight, your body contains something like 37.2 trillion cells. That's what you're made of. 37.2 trillion cells. And inside each one of those cells, there is a digitally coded database larger than the 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Every one of you is the equivalent in language information of 37.2 billion copies of the Encyclopedia Britannica. You say, I've never heard such a thing. That's the truth. Where did that complexity come from? The mind of God. Creation's complexity exhibits God's wisdom. Creation's harmony exhibits God's skill. I'll show you later on this evening the double helix of the DNA. Unbelievable. The harmony, the symmetry. Look at the human face. Isn't that amazing? the 2 ears, the 2 eyes, the symmetry. Look at the hands. Darwin used to say that the thumb just, he didn't know what to do with it. And he talked about organs of extreme perfection. That's what he called the eye, an organ of extreme perfection. Well, what more do you need to know? Creation's suitability exhibits God's goodness. I'll tell you about this a little bit later on, but there's a thing called the Goldilocks problem. You know the story, Goldilocks and the 3 bears? I don't know whether you have that in Canada or not, but she goes to this house where the bears live, and she tries one bed and it's just a bit too big. And then she tries another bed and it's a little bit too small, and so she finds this one that's just right. And then she tries the porridge, and one is a bit hot and one's a bit, and then there's one, she keeps finding these ones that are just right. Do you know what scientists have discovered in the last 40, 50 years? That this universe is just right for man. The universe is just right. The galaxy is just right. The solar system is just right. The earth is just right. It's almost as if, say some of the scientists, it knew we were coming. Why does this anthropic principle apply? Because God is a good God. And creation's suitability displays God's goodness. So, Michael Brown. We were talking about Michael Brown yesterday. Good old Michael Brown. He's a preacher from England. He lives in Bath. Not in a Bath. He lives in Bath, where the Romans used to be. And he was a marine commando, like the Royal Marines. And he got saved out in the jungles of Malaysia, and he was commanded full-time to preach the gospel. So he's in Hong Kong preaching the gospel. And he's working there and knocking on doors and tracting and preaching every night. And the Christians in the assembly are inviting their friends to come and hear the gospel. So there's a woman gets on a bus in Hong Kong on this particular day and sits down next to a Christian from the assembly. They'd never met before. But let me give you the background to this woman who sat next to the Christian. So this woman, she's now a grown woman, but when she was a child, she was brought up in a home that worshipped their ancestors, and they had little gods sitting on the mantelpiece at home. And one day she went outside as a little child, this unsaved girl. She went outside, she looked up at the stars, and she was just blown away by the stars and the glory of God and the magnitude of the heavens. And she just went back into the house and she looked at the little ancestral gods on the mantelpiece. And she said to herself, whoever made those stars has to be bigger than these things here. She's 7. Do you know what she started doing? This is a true story. One of the best stories you'll ever hear. I heard this from Michael Brown himself. She started praying to the God who made the stars. Can you just picture this little 7-year-old in Hong Kong? Every night before she goes to bed, she gets down on her knees. Dear God who made the stars. And she starts praying to the God who made the stars. Do you think he heard that prayer? So all the years go by. She's praying to the God who made the stars. Now she's a grown woman. She gets on the bus and she sits next to someone from the assembly. And the lady from the assembly pulls out her invitation. She's probably, her heart's nearly jumping out of her chest. She's thinking, oh dear, how am I ever going to face this? She says, I would like to invite you to come and hear a message from the Bible at such and such a place. She says, I think I'll come. Michael Brown's at home, preparing for the gospel meeting, reading his Bible. He's looking at this verse, he's looking at that verse. He just cannot get settled on what to speak on. And his mind seems to be drawn to Genesis chapter 1. And he's looking at Genesis 1. He's thinking, oh, how can you preach the gospel from Genesis 1? There's no gospel in Genesis 1. But he just couldn't get away from Genesis chapter 1. And he just thought, well, sink or swim, It'll have to be Genesis 1 tonight. So he arrived at the hall, got up onto the platform, hymn, prayer, hymn. Let's read the Bible. Reads Genesis chapter 1. And the lady's sitting in the audience. And as he comes down the passage, he gets day 1, day 2, day 3, and he comes down to day 4. I can just picture the scene. And he made 2 great lights, a greater light to rule the day, and a lesser light to rule the night. And he made the stars also. And the little woman says, "That's the God I've been praying to." And that dear lady got converted to Christ in the gospel hall that very evening. What's the difference between that Chinese girl and Bertrand Russell? What's the difference between that Chinese girl and Richard Dawkins? It's all in Romans chapter 1. It's someone willing to bow as a sinner and acknowledge there's a power greater than herself. That there's a God that made her, a God to whom she's responsible. Not a celestial North Korea, no, not a malicious caricature of the real God. A God that despite knowing the thoughts of men, despite knowing the intentions of men, despite knowing the wickedness of men's heart, sent his Son to die on Calvary's cross to save them from eternal hell. No, God is not the monster of atheist caricature. God is a God of grace and a God of mercy and a God of love who loves us despite our ignorance, despite our rebellion, despite the prodigal that is in us, and longs to save and longs to bless, and brought that little girl to himself. You say, well, if I was an atheist and I didn't believe in God, what would my options be? Well, this is what I'm going to finish with. Because never was there an exhibition of the foolish, culpable ignorance of man than the options that are before them when they reject God. Here are the options. Psalm 33 says, answer not a fool according to his folly, and then it says, answer a fool according to his folly. Seems to contradict itself. What's it saying? It's saying, don't answer a fool according to... Don't just waste your time in endless, silly arguments with someone that's just a fool. Not really interested in the answer. Not really sincere. Just wanting to go round and round and round. Have you ever tried to witness to Jehovah's Witness? You know what I'm saying? Round and round. And you get them on one thing, then they move to another. No sincerity. It's the same with a lot of atheists. Says the Bible, don't answer a fool. Don't waste your time in endless minutiae debates. But then it says, answer a fool according to his folly. In other words, take the folly of the fool and turn it round and throw it back at them. Answer a fool according to his folly. Let them see the folly of what they're saying. Well, let's do that with the origin of the universe. If there is no God, if God did not create the universe, in the last 10, 15 minutes, we just want to run through these. They only have 3 other options. You might like to memorize these because this is quite good. You can have some fun with this. Option number 1, the universe is not really here. It's an illusion. There are some people who believe that. Option number 2, the universe has always been here. It's always been here. It's eternal matter, etc. Third option, the universe created itself from nothing. So that's your 3 options. If you don't believe in a creator God, there aren't any other options. That's your 3 options. Have you ever met anybody who doesn't believe the universe is really here? There's some crazy people out there, I tell you. There used to be a fellow in Toronto. His name was Dr. Nathan. I got this story from Ravi Zacharias. So I've never checked up that Dr. Nathan exists. I presume he does, especially later in this story. So this student in Toronto goes up to this Dr. Nathan, who's a Christian, and says to him, "How do I know I exist?" Well, Dr. Nathan must have been ready, because his answer was this: who shall I say is asking? Wasn't that a good answer? How do I know he exists? Who shall I say is asking? You see, you can't deny your existence without at the very same time affirming your existence. That's like me saying, that's like me writing on a piece of paper, I cannot write. That's the same kind of thing. It's the same illogical outworking of ignorance. You cannot affirm your non-existence. You have to exist to say you don't exist. It's a complete argument in a circle. So this idea that we're not really here, answer a fool according to his folly. What utter folly that must be. What about this second one? The universe has always been here. Well, we read Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning God. And as I mentioned to you earlier on, that was a very unpopular view prior to the 1920s. The fact that the universe had always existed, the theory that the universe had always existed, was what science accepted through the 1700s, the 1800s, and so on. And we were made a mockery of. Genesis chapter 1 was mocked. But discoveries came along. They discovered the truth that had been out there. Now they're facing the fact that the universe must have had a beginning. So things like the second law of thermodynamics, have you heard of that? Oh, that would give you a headache, those laws of thermodynamics. There's a second law of thermodynamics which talks about entropy. This is above your head, just go to sleep for 2 minutes. The law basically states that the amount of usable energy in the universe is decreasing. So you burn a log, the log really is still there, but it's just in a different form. You cannot destroy the matter. That's the first law of thermodynamics. But once you've burnt it, you can't burn it again. The amount of usable energy is always decreasing. So just put it in simple terms. Everything is running down. Okay, so your watch is running down. You're going to have to change the battery or wind it up because it's running down. Your car is running down. This building is running down. Everything is, the sun is running down. The whole thing, this is what this law of thermodynamics is telling us. So here's a question. If your watch had always been here, would it still be ticking? If you had always been here, what on earth would you look like? If this universe had always been here, well, the law of entropy would have ensured that it would have ended up in a state of complete equilibrium a million eternities ago. The laws within this universe will tell us that it cannot have always been here. And in fact, most scientists don't believe it's always been here anyway. So we're onto an agreement there. So it's obviously not an illusion. It cannot always have been here. So we're left with this third option, which is what most scientists believe. You say, most scientists believe this? Sadly, yes. So Richard Dawkins and the rest of these guys, they believe the universe created itself from nothing. Answer a fool according to his folly. So this requires us to believe that a septillion stars came from nothing accidentally. You say, do they really believe that? They sure do. Okay, so here's a book just relatively recently published, A Universe from Nothing. It's written by Lawrence Krauss, who is a scientist, and guess what? Afterward by Richard Dawkins. Now, I'll just give you a couple of quotes before moving on with this, because it's just funny to me to even hear them say it. Here's a scientist called Paul Davies. He's a physicist. The Big Bang, says he, represents the instantaneous suspension of all physical laws, the sudden abrupt flash of lawlessness that allowed something to come out of nothing. It represents a true miracle, transcending physical principles. Here's Bill Bryson in A Theory of Everything. From nothing our universe begins. It seems impossible that you could get something from nothing, but the fact that once there was nothing and now there is a universe is evident proof that you can. Shall I say that one more time? It seems impossible that you could get something from nothing, but the fact that once there was nothing and now there's a universe is evident proof that you can. This is staggering. First of all, there was nothing, and then it exploded. The universe created itself before it even existed. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. You say, well, why would they come up with this infantile, ludicrous idea? Well, just read the back of the book. I've been telling you all afternoon, perhaps to the point of wearying you, that atheism is deliberate, and atheism is culpable, and atheism is biased. And maybe I'm not doing a good job convincing you, I don't know. So this book, A Universe from Nothing, published by Simon & Schuster, afterward by Richard Dawkins, in which Richard Dawkins says that this is the equivalent for our century of Origin of the Species for the 1800s. This is the next Origin of the Species. Listen to this. A fascinating antidote to outmoded philosophical and religious thinking. A universe from nothing is a provocative, game-changing entry into the debate about the existence of God and everything that exists. Forget Jesus, Krauss has argued. The stars died so that you could be born. I find that chilling. Mainstream, Simon & Schuster, afterward by Richard Dawkins, bestseller on the New York Times list, openly on the back cover, it's saying, forget Jesus. Jesus didn't die for you. What a horrendous idea that God sent his son and he was punished. What horrendous child sacrifice and all they're rubbish. Forget Jesus. The stars died for you. You're the result of star death. You're just a bunch of stardust. Unbelievable. This Romans 1. They did not like to retain God in their knowledge. A universe from nothing. Only there's one little problem. They're not being honest. Because when you put their feet to the fire and say, so how can you get something out of nothing? They start talking as if actually really there was something there after all. So most of this book is not really how you get a universe from nothing. He waffles and he waffles and he waffles and he waffles. And then you get to page 149 out of 191. You're pretty near the end. In a chapter called Nothing is Something. He says, first I want to be clear about what kind of nothing I'm discussing. This is the simplest version of nothing, namely, empty space. Oh. So you've got space. For the moment, I will assume space exists, with nothing at all in it. And that the laws of physics also exist. Empty space can have non-zero energy associated with it, even in the absence of any matter or radiation. He calls it the ultimate free lunch. That's the best they can do. That is the creme de la creme. That guy's video, Lawrence Krauss on YouTube, in which he explains himself how you can get something for nothing, has got, I don't know, 2 million hits or something. Nearly got something for nothing there. It's got like 2 million hits. They're all thinking this is the answer we've been looking for. And you know right well It is not only foolishness, it is a deliberate attempt to get round the obvious. And let me close with an illustration. On television in the UK, way back when, there used to be a show called Dixon of Dock Green. I never saw it, don't know anybody in it, but it ran for 25 years on British television. The guy that wrote the screenplay, was called Ted Willis, and he was an atheist. And in 1990, he was in the Houses of Parliament because he's now become Lord Willis. And he brought an amendment to the broadcasting bill in the Houses of Parliament in London. And the amendment to the bill would insist that every time religion was mentioned or promoted on the BBC, humanism had to be presented next to it. So that we can't have these Christians just saying their nonsense. It always has to be balanced by humanism. So he's in the House of Lords. I don't know whether you've ever seen the House of Lords. The benches in the House of Lords, the green benches, that's the House of Commons. The House of Lords is red benches. They're not voted in. They're given peerages. They're just handed out like sweets. You can go and sit on those benches. And so he's in the House of Lords, and he gets up. Baron Willis. That's a good name, isn't it? Baron Willis. He gets up in the House of Lords, and this is how he proposed the amendment to the broadcasting bill. This is 25 years ago. I am a total non-believer, he said in the House of Lords. I do not apologize to the committee for that. I was brought up as a primitive Methodist. I don't think they exist anymore. If you sat in a chapel on a cushion, that was a great sin. I lost my faith when I was 14. I went to the bottom of my garden and I said, if there's a God, please lift the garbage can lid. Let the garbage can lid rise, and that'll prove that there's a God. I'm sure we've done that all sometime or another. Of course, God ignored me. The garbage can lid didn't rise. This is Baron Willis explaining why he's an atheist in the House of Lords. This is his proof. He raised a few other objections to God, but basically his atheism began at the bottom of the garden trying to get the lid of the garbage can to move. Baron Willis. And now, because of his atheism, he wants to change the laws of the country so we get humanism rammed down our throat every 5 minutes. We say, well, why didn't God answer his prayer? Wouldn't that have been a lot simpler? Why didn't God just intervene and say, okay, that's fine? Well, think about Romans 1 for a minute. Let's just think of someone here today who's been married for, 40 years, 50 years. Let's go for a super long time, 50 years. And on the morning of your 50th wedding anniversary, Mary comes down the stairs thinking, what a day this is, 50th wedding anniversary, and that's wonderful. And as she walks into the kitchen, John, her husband, he's standing there and he's holding a hoop, one of these big playing hoops that the children put around their waist and so on. He's standing in the kitchen, he's holding this hoop. And Mary looks at him as if, are you feeling all right this morning? He's holding this hoop, and he says, Mary, do you really love me, Mary? Mary says, John, are you feeling all right? Have you had your breakfast? No, I'm being deadly serious, Mary. Do you really love me? John, oh, come on, John, you know I love you. We've been married for 50 years. It's our anniversary. Of course I love you. Right, and I'm being serious now, Mary. If you really love me, I want you to jump through that hoop. What do you think Mary's going to do? Mary going to jump through that hoop? Is she going to prove her love for John by jumping through some stupid hoop? I think Mary's going to run out of the kitchen in floods of tears, while saying in her heart, if he doesn't know I love him by now, there's no way I'm going to jump through that hoop. So God puts a septillion display of stars in the sky. He puts 37.2 billion cells in your body, and he packs them all with information in the form of DNA. And he winds up the solar system like a clock. And he stands back for 50 years and he says, that which may be known of me, I have showed it unto you. The invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. And Baron Willis goes to the bottom of his garden. And he says, God, if you're there, make the lid of this garbage can right. Can you believe it? As if the God of heaven is going to jump when every atheist calls upon him to demonstrate his power with some pathetic little miracle at the bottom of his garden, when all the miracles he needs are staring him in the face 24 hours a day, so that they are without excuse. The origin of truth points us to a God of truth. The origin of the universe points us to this uncreated creator. Who made God, says somebody. Oh, dear, dear, dear. By definition, God is an uncreated being. That's like saying, how long is a piece of string? What piece of string? You tell me what piece of string you're talking about, and I'll tell you how long it is. Who made God? You tell me what God you're talking about, and I'll tell you who made him. The God we're talking about is a God who existed before time. He's a timeless God. He's independent of his creation. He's an eternal God. Your question is redundant. Who created the uncreated God? It's a nonsensical question. It's another attempt to dodge the obvious. That God is really there, and God has spoken, and God has revealed his own. I trust the Lord will bless these thoughts to our hearts. Bless his word to us. I believe there's going to be a break now. Are you going to close in prayer? Close in prayer. We'll just have a word of prayer, and then we'll have some refreshment.